Hello and welcome. You're watching Weekly Brief. I'm Shweta Kothari. With me are my colleagues Karthik Malhotra as well as our Sridharan. And today, what we discussed in the newsroom and what really made news throughout the week was the much anticipated meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. A meeting that Donald Trump rated 12 out of 10. And it was in fact significant, Karthik, because it lowered the tariffs on China by about 10%. The repercussions we're still feeling and we're still reeling under them, but a significant meeting in Busan in Korea where two leaders met in what could be perhaps a start of a strategic relationship going forward and rebalancing of global trade.
Yeah, I mean, talk about G2 as Donald Trump calls it, right? So G2, the top two economies of the world, choosing a neutral location in South Korea to have that trade truce meeting. I don't think there is any announcement of a bilateral trade agreement just as yet. But 10%, sure, from a 57% you come down to 47%, great. But I think the bigger headline is that there's no more 150% tariff on China. But I think for us sitting here in Noida, in India, it's important that now India is among the highest tariffed countries in the world. So China is also lower than India. I think while there have been some announcements which have come through, the opening up of the controls on rare earth minerals is significant. India happens to become a beneficiary of that as well. In fact, we've also read that as many as 30 companies are now, auto companies are now in the line to get those approvals and get those Chinese rare earth magnets into India. And fentanyl trade, of course, again, there's a theory on whether the fentanyl flow was actually happening through China exactly or not. But a 10% reduction, is it good enough?
Right.
Because, 47% is still high. And I think the other unanswered question is, what is China getting in lieu of opening up its rare earth minerals? And does that include the high-powered NVIDIA new series of chips? And there's absolutely no news on that as yet.
There's no news on that. Shri, I think absolutely good news there as far as rare earth minerals is concerned. 1 year extension is what China has given at the moment. So the markets will still be open. We can still buy for at least 1 year as far as India is concerned. And, a lot of conversation around whether there was fentanyl flow to begin with and whether China was being penalized for what Donald Trump thought was a problem but wasn't a problem to begin with. But lowering from 57% to 47% is substantial, but also a marker that there is going to be a realignment towards strategic competition going forward, and that both countries will continue to engage with each other and will have repercussions on global markets.
That's right, Shweta. First of all, this reduction from 57 to 47 it lowers average tariff to 47%, but the minimum tariff on China remains at 20%. So that's the first part, that we need to keep in mind. When Karthik says it's a truce, I completely agree with him that this is just a temporary suspension of the hostilities between the two countries. I don't see any details of any trade pact, a significant trade pact which has been signed, which tells me that this is an enduring peace that they are talking about, because this is a 1 year deal, right? And after 1 year, this is again going to be renewed. So we are nowhere close to a long-term stable framework of trade between US and China, which the global market can take solace from and say, okay, now things are more or less predictable. We know what to do. So the uncertainty, if you're a trader, if you're a company that's dealing in the US-China corridor, for you, the uncertainty hasn't gone away. You have some breathing space for the next 1 year. But there are, in the absence of any significant details, this is essentially a soybean and a rare earth, deal in some sense, right? US exports almost $25 billion worth of soybean, to the world, out of which half is bought by China. And most of the soybean production in the US happens in Republican states. So that's the first thing which President Trump needed to get back China in the market as a buyer. Because without that, China's already gone ahead and developed Brazil as an alternate market. So that was something which the American farmers were really scared about. That something which has been there, a market which has been there for the last 50 years, is suddenly vanishing overnight. Not because China went to Brazil, but because you pushed, China towards Brazil. So that loss of market, it's not going to come back very easily. China has agreed to buy 50 million, metric tons of soybean. And in return, US gets, let's say, access to rare earths also. Now, let us not forget that when it comes to rare earth, there is no other country like China. 97% of the processing of rare earth happens in China.
Yep.
They have more than 30% of the deposit of almost 40% of rare earth deposits. And rare earth is a very dirty business to be in. It is energy intensive. For every ton of rare earth that you refine, there's 2,000 tons of toxic waste which gets produced. Now that costs money to deal with it. So which means that Europe can never get into the rare earths business. One, they don't have the deposits, even if they want to. There are so many environmental regulations which will not allow them to get into that business. US also cannot get into it, without, at least in a hurry. It might take them another 10 years if they want to. But again, the issue of where do you source the rare earths from and how do you, refine it in a manner that's like, it's cheap enough for your industry to use. So this is, and Xi Jinping knows that he's holding the aces,
Right.
and Donald Trump doesn't have too many aces.
Right,
Yeah.
and Trump has shown his cards as well. I mean, I was reading this morning, as far as foreign policy is concerned, US-China relations are not going back to prior to 2017, which means it's not going to be about cooperation anymore. It's going to be adversarial competition. And so far as Europe or the US does not develop their capacity to the point that we can compete with China, they are going to have to sit on a table and discuss with Xi Jinping. So can we say for now, at least geopolitically, that this is going to be the world order going forward in the year or two from now on, where we will see some sort of detent, if not, competition or tariffs on tariffs, but we've reached a point where both parties are now sitting on the table and saying, this is it, this is where we reach, and this is detent, and will not move forward from
So,
here.
I think I'll just take off from what Sri was saying and answer your question in that context. I think it's absolutely important to note that Sri's saying that China has all the aces. And, to use a slightly more crude word, I think China's got leverage, which no other country does. So, at the end of the day, I don't think whatever China is processing, 97% of rare earth minerals, if China is processing that capacity, there is absolutely no other competitor in the world which can come even fractionally close to what China is producing. So eliminating China from global supply chain is impossible, and I think it's going to remain impossible for the foreseeable future.
Okay.
Now, the contrary, or sort of, the difficult paradox that India is dealing with is that, does India have any leverage? Apart from the fact that we are a large consumer base for US products, does India have any leverage where what India supplies to the world is absolutely critical, that India can negotiate a deal with a bully like Donald Trump, or even pretend to diplomatically mess around with a regional bully like China? And unfortunately, the answer to that is no, India does not.
Okay.
So, is there mounting pressure on India now to go ahead and at least get the headline average tariff below 50%? I think 25% can safely get knocked off simply because of the sanctions that US has put on those two major Russian oil producers, Rosneft as well as Lukoil. So with those two big players which supply to Indian refiners and the same oil that India would refine and sell back to Europe, with that equation now pretty much null and void, I think there should be no discussion on getting rid of that 25% tariff.
Okay.
Right. Now, did we opt to not deal with Russia? No. Did we have a gun on our heads? Potentially, yes. Did it require sanctions? 100% yes. Right. So that 25% can be erased off. Now the question is the balance 25%. Is India going to continue to deal with those 25% tariffs, or, like the commentary has been made from multiple quarters, including President Donald Trump himself, as well as the Indian ministers, Piyush Goyal, who was in Washington earlier, that India is very close to signing that bilateral trade agreement. In fact, if you remember, when Donald Trump came to power on 20th of Jan this year, the timeline was fall of 2025. We are in fall of 2025, right? So we haven't really been delayed on our bilateral trade deal with the US if it does get announced this calendar year.
Right.
Now, what is that deal going to entail is the critical question, because India is not going to get any concession on that 25% tariff unless India makes concessions on what we were earlier calling the red lines. And those red lines include agriculture and dairy. And guess what's going to unfold starting next week? Bihar elections. So even if there is some sort of a verbal agreement of the contours of what India's trade deal with US is going to look like, I think any announcement, formal announcement on that is going to happen only after the Bihar elections. And if there is no deal by end of this calendar year, then I think the 25% tariff stays and we've got to deal with
So
it.
that's Karthik's assumption. So I think the government is waiting there for Bihar elections before it makes some sort of announcement as far as dairy and agri is concerned. What we're also learning is perhaps non-genetically modified soybean will make its way into Indian markets.
Again,
Some
farm
concessions
sector.
from-
Again, farm sector.
So,
Some concessions
let
on
me-
dairy as well.
So let me just add to what Karthik is saying, Shweta. So the issue of dairy, to my mind, goes beyond just Bihar elections. Let us not forget that the Modi Sarkar this term has come with the help of allies.
Yeah.
It didn't come with a clear mandate.
Yeah.
Okay, and agriculture is a very sensitive sector politically. So it's not just about Bihar, but it's about BJP coming back to power next term as well. So is that a trade-off which the BJP government or our Indian government is willing to make? I don't think so, because I expect government to remain very, very sensitive to farmers' concerns on what import of agri-produce or agricultural products from US means to the livelihood of Indian farmers. So I think we will tread a very cautious path. Now, Karthik also talked about leverage, that compared to China, we don't have an economic leverage versus US. Absolutely true. I think the only leverage we have is geopolitical. This is a time when US is trying to stymie China's emergence as a real global superpower, because in some sense, US is also ceding ground to China. If you look at its withdrawal from engagement of certain countries, it's making room for China to come in, move in, and strengthen its relations. So I think we will count on our importance as a geopolitical ally for US to draw some of those concessions, which we may not be able to force through purely based on an economic merit.
Right. So would it be fair to say, therefore, that India is right now caught between a rock and a hard place? While US happily ceded ground to China, India has little leverage. And I think we'll have to wait and watch out for when that bilateral agreement is signed between the two countries. But for now, that is what made the news in the newsroom this week.